and welcome to our 8th annual patient-centered approach to cancer clinical trials in Canada. It's so wonderful to see such a diverse crowd from all facets of the ecosystem in clinical trials. I did prepare a few notes, but I have a feeling that I will veer off my notes a little bit because I really want to make this personal. This is an event really where we interact together, not just during the conference, but after the conference. So as much as it's fantastic that we're going to hear and interact with everybody on our panels and our speakers and our patients and so forth, really it is all about what happens throughout the year and how we come back next year and fulfill some of the mission that we've created during this conference here today. So first of all, I'd like to thank our co-chairs, Drs. Rebecca Auer, Stephanie Michaud, Mike Wong, Stephen Sundquist, and our entire PACT group. PACT, if you don't know, is our Patient-Centered Approach to Clinical Trials group, who work throughout the year on what we accomplished during this meeting. I'd like to thank in advance all our esteemed presenters and panelists, and of course our staff, Carol and Anne-Marie, who will be hosting today, moderating today I should say, I'm hosting. And of course, without our sponsors, none of this would be possible. So thank you to all our sponsors who are listed, I see on the screen, I guess, behind me. So clinical trials is not something that everybody thinks about, certainly not all patients think about, unfortunately, as soon as they're diagnosed with the disease. But for me, it's a very personal thing. When I was diagnosed with metastatic cancer to liver and my lungs from the colon in 1995, clinical trials wasn't even, out there. The only reason I talked about clinical trials at that time was because when I tried to get something done or reimbursed, the government in Quebec would say, well, that's a clinical trial, we won't cover that. And that was my first introduction as a lay person to clinical trials. It's something that the government doesn't cover. So at that time, I unfortunately had to leave Canada. Some of you know that. I went to New York and I had hepatic arterial infusion, which was standard of care at that time in the United States, not in Canada. And then went out to California and participated in a vaccine trial at John Wayne Cancer Center. So this was really an interesting introduction because coupled with my surgeries, coupled with the very nominal treatment, chemotherapies that I had at that time in Canada and in the United States, I was able to look a little bit further. For me, it's what I call the don't just sit there, stupid, do something, when I had no evidence of disease following a treatment or following my surgery for a period of time. So they were very personal to me, both in Canada and in the United States, because I did get an oxaliplatin trial started at the time in the year 2000, when all the computers were going to explode, and we had to write special protocols here for that. Fortunately, it didn't explode, and we got the trial going. But there's so many new opportunities that we can bring through clinical research, where patients have to think about it not as a last resort, but especially with the development of the new immunotherapies as a first-line treatment. So we need our patients to understand about clinical trials at the time they're diagnosed with the disease. And we need to see trials where we can find the patients, right? We had our last year, as you recall, representatives who started the recovery trial in the UK, and we had from representation who said, well, if we're going to do a trial in this city and the patients are like in the north of the country, why don't we do the trial in the north of the country where the patients are? So we need decentralized trials. And we have people in the forefront here in this room today, Stephen, with the Kraft model, thinking about decentralized trials at 3CTN and other networks who are talking about how we can do it. And as you know, the FDA has mandated the need to have more more inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in our trials. So the big pharma companies are looking at it from the US perspective, and we have to think about it in Canada. How can we develop decentralized trials, not only to reach the patients where they are, so we can have full recruitment, but also have the equity, diversity, and inclusion in the trials that make them so much richer for our Canadian population. And there's so many new technologies that are coming on board. I mean, not to throw out like at every conference the word AI, but you know, AI can be used in so many different ways. Even from the patient perspective on finding the trials, working with navigators to actually identify what trials we may find. From the clinical researcher's point of view, about getting those right people into the trials, matching it with your, if there's a permission to contact. We were talking about this at the Accelerated Clinical Trials Conference the other week. How can we match through AI, knowing that the patient has given their consent with the information in the record to a clinical trial outreach to those patients who may be not necessarily in the hospital system at that particular moment in time. And then, how do we think about new types of trials? How can they be modernized in such a way that they'll go through the regulatory and HTA system, not necessarily in the way they do now, but keeping in mind precision medicines and immunotherapies, where we won't have all that data up front or for a very long time, because we're getting so good at molecular profiling that we can identify smaller and smaller subgroups of patients who can benefit at these trials and then actually get access to it. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because if we want to have investment in Canada in clinical trials, we want to encourage that investment. We know that, at least from an industry point of view, if a company is not going to be able to launch their product in the country, they won't do the clinical trials in the country. So we need to ensure that the fruits of that labor of doing the clinical trials are vested in the patients and that we get access to the innovation in Canada. Throughout our conference today, we're going to hear some amazing presentations from patients, patient representatives. We have a video as well to show you from Dr. John Huber in Ottawa, and of course Andrew Stein will be here, and Terry Harish is here as well. So we're really looking forward to getting that lived experience from clinical trials as really the common thread throughout this conference. We'll look at how we can strengthen the life sciences ecosystem as well, as a whole, from a federal government point of view. Our keynote speaker will be speaking to that, and how we can enhance that ecosystem in Canada. As well, I really want you to keep in mind, we just had this discussion before, what are the key challenges and barriers that we have in Canada with respect to clinical trials? Both, well, particularly from a patient point of view, but if we start with the patient and look all the way up the system to the regulatory, we have to deconstruct, if you will, our system to see how we can make it more accessible to patients so they can benefit from these new innovations and early on. And we know that billions of dollars are given away in free drugs, so to speak. We all want free drugs. So if we invest in those trials, patients will get access to those free drugs. And that is a really important component of how patients are accessing early innovations in this country. So we have to ask also, what is it that we're looking for in clinical trials? And we're going to have a fantastic, as many of you know, we've been totally inspired since the inception of our conferences 8 years ago by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative at Duke University. We'll be here today presenting as well on not only patient group engagement in clinical trials from ideation on all the way through the clinical trial continuum, but also how can we modernize in the next 5 years our trials? What are the key performance indicators that we should be looking at? And we'll hear what they're looking at in the United States, Duke together with the FDA as well as industry partners collaborate together south of us. So we will have a fantastic workshop today where you will have great opportunities to provide your input. We'll be keeping that data together so that we can work on that through the year and really see, can we modernize clinical trials in Canada to be more patient-centered so that more patients from coast to coast to coast benefit from all of your efforts together in the health ecosystem. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Anne-Marie Wright, who many of you may recognize from all of our other previous conferences. for the last 8 years. Anne-Marie, I'll hand it over to you and we'll continue with the agenda. And please, looking forward to networking with all of you, collaborating both during the conference and after. Thank you.
That's my privilege. Thank you so much, Mary. And it's 100% my pleasure to be with all of you today. It's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces now, having moderated and worked on this conference for the past 8 years. Truly it becomes more evolving and exciting every year. It's lovely to see so many of the same faces come and support the work that's being done here. This conference has consistently aimed at and very much succeeded at bringing together a multi-stakeholder audience. And I think it's evidenced by the folks who are in attendance today. I encourage all of you to sit at some of the front tables perhaps, but also meet your neighbor and to reach out and find somebody to connect with that perhaps you haven't connected with in the past. This conference is also, in building on what Barry has said, excellent at focusing and showcasing on elevating innovation. Innovation that puts people and patients at the center of cancer care. This conference is also cancer agnostic, and while it's presented and hosted by Colorectal Cancer Canada, the wish and hope is always that the work that gets done here has impact across the ecosystem. And finally, I think a key discerning and differentiating point of this conference is that outside of focusing not just on the why and what of change, we focus on the how of change and really getting into how we can evolve the system in meaningful ways. I too want to personally acknowledge Michael, Stephanie, Stephen, and Rebecca as co-chairs of this conference. They have been truly not names on the page. They have been people who have very prolifically contributed to the agenda and helped to bring many of you to the table. These co-chairs are as engaged in the conversation as you are, and they'll be actively participating in many of the sessions today. So I hope you'll get a chance to introduce and meet them as well. A final point I wanted to make about this conference is that it has historically been very interactive. So we've got 2 microphones, one here and one here. We want to see lineups today at those microphones. This is an opportunity for you to share your opinions, share your thoughts. And in that regard, as Barry mentioned, we have a workshop today. And these workshops came from a lot of the feedback that we get around these conferences, which is your desire to meet multi-stakeholder folks, to contribute to the conversation. So we are putting you to work this afternoon. In that regard, I just want to make sure you've got the group you're in and that you've received a workshop briefing document, and you now have a Drive file link to the workshop assignment. If you don't have any of those 3 things, the colorectal cancer team, they are amazing, and they will be very, very happy to help you in getting whatever it is you need, as am I. So if there's anything that would make your experience at this conference excellent, we're here to support you in all ways.